Now, as I said in the last part of the lecture, in 1869, Wyoming became the first territory to give women suffrage. And you're also going to see a schism within the movement of women's suffrage to try to figure out, should it be very narrow and just try to get a suffrage passed in the states, or even a suffrage amendment at the national level, or should there be a broader overall agenda? So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, certainly names that we recall going back to the earlier antebellum reform movement. They founded the NWSA, and there's going to be a bunch of these acronyms, so you got to pay attention. That's the National Women's Suffrage Association. Now, they were promoting a suffrage amendment to the Constitution, so they had a specific agenda on that, but they had a broader agenda for women's rights as well, including higher pay for women and making it easier for abused women to get a divorce. Now, other suffrage advocates thought that pursuing such multiple issues would hurt that suffrage cause. We certainly saw that, as I said, between the Knights of Labor and their very inclusive and broad agenda versus the AFL, much more narrow. The more narrow group formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, so AWSA, that only focused on voting rights. Now, in 1890, these groups are going to come together. The NWSA and the AWSA are going to form the NAWSA. And in that year, interestingly, Wyoming is admitted as a state and women get suffrage there. So Wyoming's the first territory and the first state to give women suffrage. West of the Mississippi River is where women really got the right to vote first. And again, as I told you, that goes back really to the pioneering ethos where women took on so much extra responsibility out there. Now, women's suffrage advocates, generally speaking, in the late 1800s, were arguing that the right to vote and hold office was simply a matter of justice. They said women are just as capable as men of exercising their rights and responsibilities of citizenship. Other women added on to that and said, you know what, women are actually morally superior to men. It would improve the corrupt political system. Now, these women argued that if women were involved, both as voters and as policymakers, as politicians potentially, that women would promote the welfare of society as a whole, much more than men would. And that would help the overall progressive movement. Some argued that women were better followers of Christ than men, and they would actually guard the morals of society and particularly the sanitary conditions of the cities. So what we want to understand here is in many ways women sort of relied on this, in some ways, Republican motherhood, cult of domesticity, like we are the ones who are the keepers of the hearth and home, and as a result of those skills that we have, we can sort of make society better because of what we've been doing for so long. What NASA wasn't doing was helping really the poor immigrants and black women. So still, it was very much focused on white, educated, upper middle class women. Now, when we look at sort of progressives overall, and obviously suffrage is just one of the issues, the general feeling that motivated most progressives, despite the different reforms that they were focusing on, was that their involvement was for the people, namely the little guy or the little woman, who had lost control of the nation, and that the little guy had lost out to what we call the special interests. So business and their leaders who were focused on money and didn't care about public welfare. Now, one of the famous muckrakers who wrote about politics was named Lincoln Steffens. And Lincoln Steffens was, like many progressives, said that government needs to be cleaned up. But he was actually writing about it and writing about specific cities like Philadelphia and St. Louis, where he said, this government is so corrupt, but the only way we're ever going to fix this system is to help make democracy more democratic, And what that really meant was getting people involved in the process. One of those ways is called the direct primary, where it allows all the members of a political party, at this point, the two main political parties are Democrats and Republicans, to vote on their party's nominees rather than the traditional practices where just a bunch of party leaders came together and chose the candidates. Today, we have primaries. We have primaries some 6 to 8, sometimes even 10 months before the general election, where the Republicans choose who they're going to run for an office, and the Democrats do as well. Then there's something called the initiative and the referendum, and they go together, but one comes first. The initiative, and think of the word initiate, is where people get signatures on a ballot to put an issue on there. Let's say they want something changed, they get enough signatures, and then it goes on the ballot. The referendum is when it's referred back to the people for the vote. So the initiative gets the issue on the ballot. The referendum is when the people vote on it. But what this does is it actually bypasses lawmakers altogether. It makes it so the people have a voice of what people ultimately are going to get to vote on the ballot. You also have the recall. This idea that, sometimes politicians are in there for 2, 4, 6 years, depending on the office, be it House of Reps, be it, governor or president before, and then 6-year terms for the Senate. But you know what? Maybe they're corrupt. Maybe they're incompetent. So it's the idea that with enough signatures, you could have sort of a recall election to get them out of office. And then you have the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators. Now, going back to the Constitution, in the Constitution, senators were picked by state legislatures. So going back to the Constitution, remember, the president is not directly elected. You have the Electoral College. The judicial branch is not in any way directly elected, seeing as though the president nominates and the Senate is actually going to approve. The Senate was not directly elected. It was only the House that was directly elected. But as a result of the 17th Amendment, you are now going to have both senators and House members that are directly elected. Now I'm going to switch to something that's a little odd. It's called the efficiency movement. And it was really about how to make work sort of more transparent in terms of what's going on. But it does have a link ultimately to cleaning up government, so I'm going to explain it. Now, I know we have Frederick Jackson Turner earlier with the Turner thesis. This time we have Frederick Winslow Taylor, okay? And Taylor had something called scientific management, which was designed to show employers how they could cut waste and improve their productivity by basically taking a job that someone would do and break down all the work activities that they do into a sequence of mechanical steps. And they did this using stopwatches and measuring how much time it took each worker to perform each step. So you'd have these sort of long lists of performance standards for each job classification. So if you were this type of machinist, you would do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, and it would take you so long. If you met those performance standards, you could get sort of a cash incentive. The goal of this quote-unquote Taylorism, as far as Taylor was concerned, was to usher in a mental revolution in business management that would improve productivity and profits, and it would raise pay for the most efficient workers, those people who met the standards, and ultimately would reduce the likelihood of worker strikes because workers would know exactly what they had to do and what they, kind of incentives they could get. But many workers looked at Taylorism and said, listen, this is just trying to make us work faster, and he doesn't really understand what we're doing. But the link to the progressive era is really that political progressives looked at Taylorism and said, we can make our government infrastructure more productive as well. And so they called for the reorganization of state and federal agencies to eliminate duplication. So you didn't have the same type of office being done by 2 different people. The establishment of clear lines of authority, who would say what and who would follow. And then the replacement of political appointees with trained specialists. So getting rid, again, of much of this sort of patronage and getting in people who are educated and knew how to do the job. Now, in order to really get rid of a lot of the corruption that was going on in government, and many of the people that were just sort of there because they had helped out part of the political machine and now they had a job, they tried to install 2 different types of systems. And again, not necessarily in any one place you'd have both systems, but these are 2 different type of alternatives to try to get rid of the corruption. Now, one was a commission system, where you placed the ultimate authority in a board of commissioners. And these board of commissioners would make the laws and execute the laws. So it's sort of like by sort of a, almost like you had a board of directors for a business. Then you could also have the city manager plan, where you'd have an appointed professional. At this point, you had people who had degrees in like urban planning and urban management, and they would actually run the city or the county, and they would do it with an elected council, city council or mayor, but really the decisions were made by this city manager. In both ways, it was a way to get around all of the corruption that would go when people were, particularly mayors and city council members were running for office and promising everything to everybody. It was a way of bypassing that, okay? Now, specifically in Wisconsin, you had a governor named Fightin' Bob, or Robert La Follette, and he is considered really to be sort of the foremost progressive when it comes to state politics. And he called, Wisconsin a laboratory for democracy. He was a Republican, and he had declared war on corporate combinations and political corruption. And his goal was he wanted to create as much as possible a nonpartisan state government. Again, not focused on Democrats or Republicans, but focused on really cleaning everything up. Now, he gave elected officials nonpartisan research, advice, and help in drafting laws. Again, trying to use expertise, particularly expertise coming out of University of Wisconsin at Madison, so that people weren't making political decisions, but they were making very sort of calculated decisions. Now, Fightin' Bob enacted the direct primary, which we talked about, stronger railroad regulation, conservation of natural resources, and workman's comp programs. So again, in some ways, Fightin' Bob was doing with this Wisconsin idea what people like Teddy Roosevelt will encourage once he actually comes back. We'll talk about that much later, after leaving the presidency and running again as a progressive candidate. The Wisconsin idea really boiled down for Fightin' Bob to this commitment to use government power to make a happier and better state to live in, where institutions were more democratic and the opportunities for all of the people were more equal and social justice more nearly prevails. Again, this idea of giving power back to the people by making government efficient and not corrupt. Now, we talked about women's suffrage. Now we're going to talk about the campaign against drinking. Now, famously, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, or the WCTU, these were, as I mentioned before, middle-class women reformers, mostly motivated by strong religious convictions, and they saw that alcohol, according to their Protestant beliefs, was really a sin. Now, again, that was only some of them. Most of them didn't see it necessarily as a religious issue, but they actually saw excessive drinking, and this is not just drinking in the home, but drinking at saloons, as a threat to social progress and particularly to family stability, such as, hey, where's dad? Well, dad's out there spending all of our money in the saloon, and on top of that, when he comes home, he's not a very nice guy. So overall, the WCTU sought to do the following: improve family life by preventing domestic violence by fathers and husbands, reduce crime in the streets, and also there's a political element to that, because not only were saloons a place where party bosses could come and give people free drinks and sort of get party support, but there was this whole idea of free beer on election day in order to sort of quote unquote buy votes. So it was trying to get rid of political corruption. But as the name suggests, Women's Christian Temperance Union, temperance is not prohibition. It's actually the reduction of alcohol consumption. So it starts more with temperance, but it's ultimately going to move all the way towards abstinence, or just non-drinking altogether. The name you need to remember with the WCTU is Frances Willard. Believe it or not, this all happened really in Evanston, Illinois, which means it's not the best place to go to school if you're hoping to have a lot of fun at Northwestern, because it was a dry town for so long because the WCTU had been there, but I digress. So Frances Willard took over the WCTU, and she moved sort of beyond this moral, persuasion of saloon keepers and drinkers and, don't drink, don't sell. And then actually was trying to make it so that there was a total ban on alcohol. So if she couldn't get individual saloons and individual drinkers to stop, she would try to just ban alcohol altogether. But much like we saw with the NWSA, with its sort of broader agenda more than just voting, the WCTU is not just going to focus on alcohol. It's going to focus on an 8-hour workday, regulation of child labor, government-funded kindergartens, the right to vote for women, and federal inspections of the food industry. So again, what you want to understand is, much like we saw with the antebellum reform movement, even though people might have sort of one primary focus, that oftentimes bled into other related reforms that they wanted. Now, you don't just have the WCTU, you actually have the Anti-Saloon League, which comes around in 1893. And this is a church-based group that pioneers this single issue. They're not focused on all these reforms. They're focused on getting rid of saloons. They started by trying to close down saloons rather than just abolish alcohol, but they pretty quickly transformed into a prohibition group and fought to outlaw liquor in state and federal elections. And then famously, at their Jubilee Convention, their 20-year anniversary, in 1913, the American Saloon League officially endorsed a constitutional amendment prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and consumption of alcoholic beverages, which will ultimately lead to, we know, prohibition at the end of World War I.